Hey, what's up? Liron here. Today's a special video. I'm excited to share with you and explore with you the concept of movement and delicate and gentle and accurate control in wet and wet. Okay, look at this background, lots of movement, lots of dynamic energy, and making the most out of those wet and wet stages. A challenging technique, but I think you're gonna really enjoy this one. Now, before we get to it, if you enjoy my videos, I would really appreciate it if you like this one and comment down below. It really helps the video reach more people. With that, let's get started.
Okay, so I just want to mention, I think I edited this one really well. I made sure to keep in all of the important parts, but also I made sure it's not too long of a video, it's not too boring. So let's start with the drawing stage. The focus here for me is actually the horses. I don't care as much about the background, it's very simplified. So you see I got just a couple of basic shapes. About the horses, I do want to make sure I place them in correctly, and also I'm putting a lot of emphasis on gesture and movement. If you'll notice how I'm drawing, I'm looking at large curves, S curves, C curves. I'm making sure to capture the general motion for the legs, for the different body parts, and only then will I go in and actually add some details. And I find that this way works really well for me. Especially with organic shapes and animals and people, you want to make sure that they look dynamic and they have good motion behind them. So you see I'm really focusing on the main shapes, the main curves. Okay, now I already am starting to indicate that cloud of dust around the floor, which is also really important. It's going to be a major part of this painting, as you'll see soon, to give it this sense of motion, feeling of movement and dynamism. Is that a word? Like dynamic movement. Now the second horse, pretty similar process. Again, focusing on the main movement. Its position is actually quite similar to the other horse in the front. They just are in a different cycle in their running. Just a different part of the running cycle. Now, once I have the motion in, I can go in and start indicating the actual details. So here I'm getting the mane of the horse, an important part, because as you can see, there's a strong highlight there, and that'll contrast very nicely with the background. So the mane is a major part. And now I'm getting in the ears, getting in the shape of the head. The shape of the head also, this horse at the front has a stripe along the center of the face, a lighter stripe, could be white, but there's so much in the shadow that it's not really visible. So I did want to get that in, got the nostril in, some indication for the eyes, and now I'm going over the motion gesture lines I put in earlier, strengthening them with pencil and adding some of the details. You get to see me also add where the light and shadow are on the body of the horse, some of the tail. Just a couple of things to help guide me through. You don't need much. It's pretty much a silhouette of the horses because they're dark on a light background. There isn't a lot of variation within the horses themselves. Here's some debris. So there isn't a lot of variation. It's a relatively simple just shapes to fill in, okay? Some indication for tree branches in the background because you can see some of them there, but the background is going to be mostly very blended and blurred together, okay? To create a sense of motion, I'm putting the focus on a very clear spot, which is the horses, and to be more precise, the horse at the front. The horse in the back is kind of a mid-ground, and then the background gives it this contrast. Background is blurry, okay? Horses in the front are sharp. You'll see this happening right now in a few moments in front of our eyes. So with this painting, a major part is doing wet and wet. The background, to preserve its smoothness and soft edges, to bring the horses to focus, we need to rely heavily on wet and wet. So what I'm doing is pre-wetting the paper. This is a 300 grams arch paper. I ran out of Saunders Waterford, unfortunately, but I have to say this paper is really good. I bought a 9-yard roll, something like that, and it's really good. The only thing I have to be careful for is the highlights on the mane of the horse at the front. Everything else is gonna be darker, okay? Now I actually went a little overboard and put in too much white space, but that's fine. That happens sometimes. It's not gonna ruin the entire impression. It will still look good, as you'll see. So on the back of the horse and the mane, I left that highlight. The rest I'm gonna cover fully, including the horse at the back. It seems like there is a small highlight on the horse at the back, but it's not really highlight. You'll see it's all darker than the horse at the front. So now we pre-wet everything. I'm going over some areas, looking at the sheen of the paper to make sure it's wet enough, and then I go in with the initial wash. So the sky's a little darker than just the paper white, so I'm starting to apply a bit of a light value there. And then as I move towards the trees, I start to apply some darker paint. So you really have to practice this. You can't really learn from just watching me paint, but try and look at the palette and see the consistency of paint I use. To get this to show, you have to use a lot of paint, a lot of pigment, because we already have so much water on the paper. We have to come back with strong paint, stronger than you would normally. On a dry paper, this would be black. But here, because we have so much water on paper, this black immediately diffuses into the water and you get a lighter effect. Now, look at the main shapes here. All I care about is getting the areas that are darker to be darker. So some of the debris, some of the floor, the trees in the background, and you have to calculate into this the movement. Okay, because again, wet and wet, a lot of the paint moves. That's what we're after. We're after this movement, the gradual changes. We just have to make sure that things stay where they're supposed to be. Okay, so a good trick for you is to start from the middle of a shape, from the center of the shape, or from, just farther from the edge, and then start applying the paint and seeing how much it spreads out. Just to make sure you don't get outside the lines too much when we do need precision. So you see me starting with the bottom of the ground, working my way upwards. Now for the trees, some very dark areas there, so I'm starting to apply darker and darker paint. In theory, you could finish an entire painting doing wet and wet. Okay, a lot of people are very confused with just how much of that technique they should use. Think about it this way. The paper is really wet when you get started. You apply paint, you get very strong movement, you get a lot of motion, a lot of blending going on. And then with time, the paper dries more and more. In theory, you could continue working on it all the way till it's completely dry, and you'll end up with a finished painting. Because when it's almost completely dry, you put in the darkest darks, you can be done. Okay, so just a point for thought, you can exploit wet and wet as much as you want. I can actually re-wet and add more paint and re-wet. And how do you re-wet? Not by putting in more water, because that'll create a big mess and will spread out the paint. The way you would re-wet this, if you want to, is by spraying some water with a water sprayer. You just go tss, and you'll get everything diffusing more. Here is the back horse. Now, the back horse is fairly light, and there are also a lot of areas that are blended, which is why I'm applying this paint now. I want especially the legs to blend into the floor. So every area I want to blend together, I have to put in now, because that way I'll get the gradual transitions. Later on, I can make things sharper where necessary. But for now, where I want the color to blend, I have to put in the paint. So this is why, again, I started with the legs on the front horse, and you see I'm just starting to connect the floor to the horses. So I'm applying some paint onto the paper. Still very wet. There's still a lot of movement, a lot of motion. Some branches there. While it's starting to dry, I know more of these will be visible. Okay. Now notice the horse at the back, actually, the paint spread out. The way to correct this, I will show you in just a moment, is to lift. So you not only can you add paint and make things darker, you can also lift and make them lighter. And you can lift in many ways, with the brush, with a dry brush, with toilet paper. There are plenty of ways you can inject more water in it, which will spread out the paint. So it's not really lifting technically, but you make it lighter. So there are many ways to, and by the way, this is really thick paint, just to get the branches to stay there and not to blend out. Now here you see me lift. You saw me just now lifting the paint, the excess paint. You're going to see me in a moment zoom in. I'm going to show you exactly how I do it up close. But this lifting, you see how it straightens the shape of the horse, okay? Now I'm injecting more and more paint wet and wet, but I'm very careful. Again, I'm putting just a bit to see how much it will spread out. Remember, now the paper is starting to dry. As time moves, the paper gets drier and drier, so you get more control. So I'm actually starting to apply more and more paint. This is a sense you develop with time, how wet it should be. You kind of average out the wetness on paper and the wetness on the palette. So if the paper is really wet, again, you'll have to mix stronger, thicker paint than you would think, and then they average out on paper. If the paper is starting to dry, you don't have to mix as dark of a paint. So you'll see me use maybe more water later and more of that stuff. Now there is a shadow at the back of the horse, so it should be darker, so I'm putting in more dark paint and just slowly building it up. You don't have to go as complex as this subject. You don't have to paint 2 horses and a background. You can just choose one of them. Focus on that. Look at the reference photo. Choose a section to focus on if you want to practice, this skill of wet and wet. Just do it this way. So now I'm going to start connecting the bottom of the horse into the debris and the cloud there to make the bottom part of this horse really blend with the floor. That'll help with the sense of speed, with the sense of movement. And it will really enhance the focal point, because more blended areas will make the sharper areas look better. Now here, I don't know why instinctively I decided it's going to be a good idea to also spray some paint. You'll see me just in a moment spraying some paint on the paper with the brush. Basically, you put one finger and then you hit the brush on it and the paint flies towards the paper. You'll see me do that in just a few moments. Just getting the darkest. Here you go. You see how I'm just dripping and hitting the brush against my hand. What this does is it creates these splatters, and you'll see soon how they're going to help us with the sense of focus and speed, because what we'll get is blurry splatters in the background and then sharp wet on dry details later on. Okay, now I'm trying to fix the shape of the mane. It's kind of too late for that. Let me show you some lifting up close. You see, whoop, I'm lifting the paint from between the horse's legs, thus making the shape sharper. I'm also putting wet and wet to enhance the contrast with the light back of the horse. Okay, so you're always adding, removing, adding, removing. Now, I will just explain. Now the paper is fully dry. Okay, the last cut we did, now the paper is dry. And I'm starting to fill in the shapes of the horses. Now, the reason I fill in the horse at the back is there's just one reason. The edges aren't clean enough. Okay, so I'm using very wet paint. It looks much darker than it would look in the final result, trust me. I'm using very wet paint just to sharpen the edges of the horse. That's the main purpose here. It's not meant to darken too much. I don't want it to darken too much. I just want to show that the edges are there. And notice the more I go down, lower, I'm starting to really blend it into what's already on paper. You see, you'll see this in just a moment. I'm coming back with some water and I'm just moving the paint very gently because I wanted the legs to fully blend, okay, into the bottom or the distance. This horse is not the focal point. It's going to stay at the back. It's going to be a little blurrier than the one in the front. Now, there is a beautiful kind of layering to it because you'll see the horse in the front is going to be very sharp. This one I'm working on right now is going to be a little blended and the background is fully blended. So you'll get this beautiful sense of depth in addition to everything. The edges and the values will really help us dictate that sense of depth. So now we're moving on to the horse at the front. And this one's really going to be the sharpest element in this painting probably, unless you count for the debris on the floor. Now, an important note. So I'm slowly building up its shape. It is very important for me to preserve the flow at this stage. I want to make sure that the shape I get here is relatively even without any hard edges and areas that started to dry. Because this horse is so much in the foreground, but it's still in the shadow. It's still kind of against the light feeling. So it's very, very important that I preserve the flow. Now you see me coming back with some cleaner water to get the light area on the face. And then after that, I'm going to soak back some of it. And then I'm going to come back and add the darks around it. In that way, I'll get the nice little light area in the... And you can also put first the paint and then lift. I do it every time I do it a different way. Sometimes I'll add water and help the paint move into the other areas. Sometimes I'll lift, depending on my mood. But I'm very aware of the bottom of the shape right now because it's starting to dry and I don't want a hard edge there. Okay, I don't want a hard edge there. Now, the horse's back, the top part, where a human would, in theory, sit, that area is hit by light, so it's lighter. So I'm going to skip it for now. However, it's not as light as the background. So what you'll see me do is later on glaze an entire new layer on top of it, just to bring that area to a darker place and also to darken some areas on the horse's body. You'll see it all make sense in the end, okay? But for now, the most important part is to preserve the movement here. You see it already, some of the edges started to dry. I have to work fast. Then you can, if you paint a lot, you'll notice when it happens, even looking at other people paint. So you see how the wash isn't perfectly even? That's because, again, some of the edges started to dry, some of the edges, but I am doing my best to make sure to save that, to keep that to a minimum, okay? So now moving down with the legs. Now remember what I told you, the bottoms of the legs are going to blend with the cloud of debris on the floor. That's another thing that will help with the motion and creating a nice focus around the horse's head, maybe the face. So as I move downwards, the mix on my palette is becoming lighter and lighter, okay? And especially here where I'm going to stop in just a moment near the start of the legs, you'll see me going back and getting much lighter paint and coming back, and you see how it moves. The paint moves with the water and gets lighter and lighter. I cut out a lot of the mixing because I didn't want to bore you with it, and you can't really see the palette. So sorry if you do want to see them. It's not that important. Every time I just add a bit more water, and I'll soon probably switch to a smaller brush too. But you see, I'm just using these water to move the legs, okay? I want to make sure, especially for the front legs, that it just perfectly mixes with this cloud of debris, okay? And that will really play with the edges in an interesting way. So you see the leg kind of disappears almost into the cloud. Now I'm starting to indicate some of these, debris flying around, rocks, whatever it is, dust. And what you'll see, I'm using both dry brush and just putting in dots. Now notice one important factor here. This dry brush and dry dots, look how they layer with the splashes from before. Notice how they create this sense of some of the debris in the back, some of the debris in the front. It's an interesting sense of depth. This dry brush layering with blended areas is perfect. I love it. That's really the essence of watercolor. You get all this variety of edges that you can't get with other media, at least not to the same quality, I would say. So this is really, really important. Okay? Now, so I'm really making sure to put in enough details that will be interesting. I'm going to add the tail, and then you'll see me, and then we're going to go into time-lapse because it's just more of the same. I'm going to layer on top of the horse another layer of paint to get that light back a little darker, but I'll also make sure to, once I get to the darker areas of the horse, to use this opportunity to inject this dark paint, you see? Because I did miss some values there, so I'm going edit real fast. You see me obviously time-lapse, so it's even faster. That's double speed, I believe. But I'm doing it really fast in real life as well, because I already messed up the first wash in a way, because it wasn't perfectly even. So now I want to make up for it and make sure that this second glaze is much more even and much more fluid. Okay, that's really important for me. So yeah, doing the exact same thing, moving from top to bottom. Now I'm going to add some details to the face of the horse as well, while it's a little damp. Just going to indicate where that white stripe in the middle is. Going to put in the eyes, kind of wet and wet, the nostrils, and it will slowly take the shape of a finalized, beautiful horse. And I really love the way this painting looks. I really, really love it. And with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. I'm going to talk a bit about it.
Okay, so this one's officially done and signed. Now, a couple of notes. I considered adding some white touches because the mane of this horse feels lighter. And also, you could add some dry brush tree branches just to bring out some details in the distance. The problem with this is that where you add details is where the viewer's eye is going to stop. And due to the very dynamic nature of this painting, I actually want it to be as flow and smooth. So essentially, as I mentioned, the background was done the moment we finished the first wash. That's just how it is. Aside from some of these details down here, it was done. This kind of a painting where you want to express movement and you want everything to kind of blend and blur together, you really don't want to put in stop points here. You don't want to let the viewer stop too much. We have these wet and wet branches, and that's really more than is necessary. Well, it is what's necessary, to be honest. I'm very happy with this one, and I think it turned out actually just the way I had envisioned it. What I could improve, perhaps, I'm always trying to think about what could be improved. Maybe just getting some more definition on the branches in the background during the wet and wet stage. I also think this section of mid value could have been a little stronger, a little darker. So I got the darkest darks right, but maybe the mid values could have been a little better. But you know, there's always things to improve. There's always things to do better next time. But I'm really, really pleased with how this one turned out. Now let's wrap it up face to face. So here we go, the final result. I hope you enjoyed this one again. And I will say this, all of these little things I mentioned, a lot of it, you know, it's just food for thought, other possibilities to try. I'm actually 100% pleased with this one. I think I was able to achieve a really good sense of movement, motion, what I wanted with this, some happy accidents here along the way that really helped to convey that sense of speed. So sometimes these things really end up working nicely without you trying. I do encourage you to explore in depth this technique of wet and wet, pushing it all the way to the end, lifting while you're doing it, charging while you're doing it, playing around with different consistencies of water to paint ratio, you know, different thicknesses. It really makes a huge difference, and these delicate ways of controlling watercolor I find to be extremely important if you want to truly reach that next level, which I'm currently aiming at. Okay, so thank you once again for watching. Don't forget to like this video if you still haven't, and also comment down below your thoughts. If you can share this with someone you know will enjoy it, I would greatly appreciate it. It really helps me reach new people. And one last note, if you want to learn how to paint like me, how to paint more freely, enjoy the process, and get the results you want, be sure to check out the frustration-free watercolor course. Link is always in the description box below. We'll teach you how to let go, enjoy the process. So many people have gotten it and have given me really good feedback. So thank you so much if you're one of them. With that, we're going to wrap it up, and I'll see you again in the next video.